At the end of the Consistory Room clock part 2, you saw the sides being cut. Now it's time to work on the top and the bottom. But before I actually cut the pieces for the top and the bottom, I wanted to make sure that the spindles weren't going to interfere with the door when the door is opened up. And it's a good thing I checked, because if the spindles were placed where I originally planned, the door would not have been able to open up wide enough to easily set the hands. So as you can see, this is a pretty easy fix here. Instead of having the spindles tight up against the sides of the clock like I originally planned, I just moved them out about 1/2 inch. Problem solved. So now I know that the pieces I'm going to cut for the top and the bottom have to be at least 15.5 inches long. I've got another consideration going on here, and that is that if I bevel the top of the clock to match up with the molding that I'm going to put along the top, then that means that the top has to be even a little bit more wider. So once again, I've got to figure out what is the minimum increase I can get away with here. I've got a piece of scrap here that's 3/4 of an inch, and it's same as the oak. And I'm going to use that along with a router bit that I've got and sort of profile it a bit, and I hope that when I put everything together, it's all going to look like one big piece of molding. This is what it looks like with the first test run, but you know, I think if I split the difference here and raise my router bit about 1/8 of an inch, the piece is going to look a little bit more symmetrical, and it'll match up a little bit better with the molding. So it looks like profiling the top so it's going to match the molding is going to add about an extra 1/2 inch out each side. So now the top has to be 16.5 inches. Now because the molding on the bottom of the clock is going to be going in instead of out like the top, the bottom of the clock can be 15.5 inches. Okay, there's the top and the bottom. Now I just have to profile them on the router. Well, a little sanding and I think they'll be okay. Because the back of the clock is going to be recessed into the case, I have to rabbet out the sides and the top. Now the bottom of the clock, as well as not being as wide as the top, it's not going to be quite as deep as the top. So that means it has to be cut down about 1/2 inch here. Rabbeting out the top and the bottom was a little bit more tricky because I didn't want the rabbet showing out the ends of the boards. I was a little bit worried while I was doing this because I could actually see the splinters being sucked into the air intake there, and I was afraid it was going to be a pretty jagged job, but as it turned out it wasn't too bad. As I mentioned earlier, this oak is very splintery, and so I got to trim this up just a little bit. I've got to trim the sides here to match the top and the bottom. Now I'm planning on cutting these pieces one more time, about a 1/2 inch strip off each piece, and I'm going to be making the door frame out of those pieces. I want the door frame to be a little bit rounded over, and this scrap piece of mahogany is the same thickness as the sides, and I'm going to use it as a sort of a test to see how it's going to look. The round over is just about right, but I can see a little tiny ridge along the edge. I'm going to have to lower the router bit maybe 1/100th of an inch here. Well, if this thing is working properly, that's a 128th of an inch. Without question, the easiest time to round over a small narrow piece is when it's attached to a big piece. So I'm going to cut it off after it's rounded over. This piece is going to be for the top and the bottom of the door frame. I'd forgotten to cut two pieces the same length as the spindles and sides when I was cutting the spindles and sides. And now that I'm all set up, I may as well cut them now, get it over with. You'll see what they're going to be for later. Now this little short piece that I had cut off, it was already fairly straight and smooth, but if I pass it through the jointer here, it'll make it perfect, and it'll slide through the router a lot easier. These magnetic feather boards that I got from Canadian Woodworker are absolutely fantastic. Notice how clean that tabletop is? And I didn't just clean it up either. You know, anybody who's used a router a lot knows how they're notorious for throwing dust and chips all over the place. Well, I got that problem solved. This homemade attachment on the bottom of the router table goes over to my small dust collector, and then on the top, it's hooked up to my main unit. Problem solved. I've never made a frame for a glass door this thin before. They've always been like 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch. And this one I'm going to have a 3/4 by a half. See how it goes. I'm going to let this video speak for itself. Once again, it's easier to show you than to tell you. Well, I can tell already by looking at these pieces that this frame is not going to be all that strong, at least not until the glass is glued in place. The glass is what's going to give it its strength. Now I've got 2 or 3 more coats of varathane that I've got to put on the pendulum dial ring and the disc ring and the pendulum rod. And if I don't get at that, this case is going to be done and they're not going to be ready. I'm going to remount those rings back in the lathe. As I mentioned, I can do a much more even job of sanding if it's slowly turning. Once this dial is mounted in the case, the only part that's going to be visible on this ring is the outer edge here. No use sanding in the middle, it's not going to be seen. Okay, I think I've got about as much dust off of this as I can get. And I've never tried this. I'm going to try putting the varathane on while it's slowly turning. I'll let you know how this turned out at the end of the video. This is a first for me. I'm making this video as I go along here. There's none of those phony reenactments. If I make a mistake, you're going to see it. This oak ring for the pendulum disc is like super fragile, so I gotta be like super careful. I don't think there's going to be too much dust off that little ring, but as long as I've got a really good dust collection system, I may as well use it. No use breathing in any more of that varathane dust than you have to. And once again, only this outside area right here is going to be seen. So that's all I'm going to sand. So okay, over the next few days I'm probably going to have to do this 3 or 4 more times, but I won't make you watch it. Remember those 2 extra pieces that I cut to the same length as the spindle? Well, I'm going to work on those now. Here we are back at the drawing, and you see the spindles on the sides. Now if you were to take them away, I want the back of the clock to be profiled the same as the spindles, like this. I should be able to recreate the profile exactly that I had for the spindles because I kept the template. I want those 2 side pieces to be a mirror image of each other, so if I watch what I'm doing, it should work out. I had never used my 3/4 inch bandsaw blade for cutting a curve before, and I just wanted to make sure that it was going to be able to handle the radius on those sides. Okay, I just have to remember to leave the line here. I can always take it down to the line on the oscillating spindle sander later. Alright, it's later, and this machine does a wonderful job sanding an inside curve. I don't want that new profiling to just have a sharp edge, so I'm just going to round it over here a little bit. It'll match up better with the spindles. I'm just cutting a little bit off the end of each one of those pieces that's going to go up the sides of the case. And the reason for that is so that they're all exactly the same length. Remember those 2 pieces that I profiled exactly the same as the spindles? Well, now that I know where the sides of the clock are going to be, I can cut those pieces to the right size. Here I'm using the headless pinner again just to hold everything in place, so when I drill the holes for the screws, everything stays lined up perfectly. I'm not planning on gluing this case together. I'm going to screw it together, and the reason for that is so that after it's all done I can take it apart and then sand and stain each piece separately. I think it'll be easier. Then I just have to screw it all back together. We'll see how it goes. Now you can see why it was important to have all 6 of those side pieces the exact same length. The back of the clock is going to go down into this slot, and it's important that it's flush all the way around. Okay, this is the last of the 22 screws that are holding this all together. Now we can see what this is going to look like. Well, sort of. I thought that I was going to have to spring the case a little bit one way or the other to make it square, but it already was square. I was pleasantly surprised. The back of the clock was deliberately made a little bit bigger than that slot that it's supposed to fall into. Reason for that is it's a lot easier to cut it smaller. You can't cut it bigger. Okay, it fits, but it's pretty tight. And right now the humidity is fairly low. It's wintertime. And in the summertime, when the humidity gets a little higher, it could expand, and I want to leave room for expansion. It's a little bit tight right here. Since there's so little that has to be removed, and also because it has to be at an angle, I think it's probably safer to slowly sand it off. And take it down just a smidge on the sides to allow for that expansion I was talking about. Okay, it's time to start working on that molding for the top and the bottom. And remember I said that if I make a mistake, you'll see it? Well, see if you notice what I forgot to do here. Yep, I forgot to turn on my vacuum system. Okay, I'm pretty sure you get the idea here. I've got a little problem here, but it should be an easy fix. Remember when I rounded over that piece of molding because it had that ridge on it? Well, the molding looks really good on the top, but it doesn't match up on the bottom because of that round over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about a blade width off here, and that should take care of that round over, and then it'll be nice and square. I'm going to fasten these pieces of molding together with 5-minute epoxy. I was thinking of getting all fancy here and using sort of a biscuit system, but then I thought, well, there's such a large area here, the glue should hold it just fine. Squeeze out is always hard to remove in a place like this, but if I'm careful I should be able to remove it without cutting the corners off. Okay, I think I got it ready for sanding here. Okay, it's time to drill the holes now to fasten the molding to the top. And I'm noticing there's a bit of a gap here, so I'm going to have to position the screws in such a way that they draw those two pieces together. And another huge consideration is I don't want to drill right through into the visible side of the case. If I grind the points off of these 2-inch long screws, they'll be just the exact right length. I like to snug the screws up by hand, less of a chance of stripping out the threads in that oak. That's much better, but I think I'll add one more screw in between the two that are there. If you remember back in video 1, I resawed one of those boards so I could take advantage of book matching. Now I can have the back of the clock two ways. I can have it like this, or I can turn it 180 degrees and have it the other way. But I don't know which book matching end is going to show up the best until I get the stain on. So I was planning on staining everything all at the same time, but I think I'm going to have to do the back first so that I can see which end is best. So then I'll be able to drill the holes that are going to hold the back on. Now I was just noticing this video is over 21 minutes long, so I'm going to cut it off here. You're going to have to wait for part 4 to find out how this stain turned out.